All right, welcome into the Newport This Week video podcast series. I'm Bill Bartholomew. Remember, you can find each and every episode of this show at newportthisweek.com or on the Newport This Week YouTube channel. Della Wells joins us from Emmanuel Church today to talk about something that is obviously, without any question, is one of the major events happening right now in the world. And it's something that is so important to humanize, to localize, and to process from a level of empathy and, to a certain extent, self-care and reflection. So thank you for doing this. And Della, really, again, thanks for localizing this topic. And that topic, of course, is the conflict in Israel and Gaza right now.
Thank you very much for including me in this conversation.
So there's an article in Newport this week that listeners and viewers can find titled "Finding Community in Conflict." And I'm going to just read from the first paragraph here. Amidst the growing tensions in the Israel-Palestine conflict on a global and national scale, the Emmanuel Church rector Della Wells and the Jerusalem Peace Builders founder Reverend Canon Nicholas Porter reflected on how locals can cope with the conflict and continue conversations for peace. And you offer several suggestions. I love that notion of continuing conversations for peace, because ultimately that's the most important thing here. And the very first one of these recommendations or suggestions is having conversations with your community. Talk about that if you could.
Absolutely, and thank you. It is not easy, and here we are headed into holidays of all kinds. Our Jewish friends have just experienced Hanukkah and are into the last day. We are headed into Advent, headed into Christmas. And so these are times that our families get together and our friends get together. And there are times when I hear frequently in the parish, how do I speak with my friend who's had this experience and whose experience is so different from mine? How do I have dinner? How do we talk? And I think that my response to that is we must rush to the heart of empathy. In these times, to borrow what Canon Porter said so eloquently about it, we can't be partial, we can't be impartial, but we must be multi-partial, because all people with their associations are hurting. And there's no way to understand in human terms the atrocity of the attack by Hamas, and there's no way to understand in human terms the incredible loss of life and humanitarian crisis in Gaza. People are hurting, and these things are awful. And we have the opportunity to hear and to empathize with and to be close to and to walk with our friends and our family members who are experiencing this pain. It's not a time for answers. It's time for conversation. It's a time for seeing each other for the human beings that we are, and seeing the pain and recognizing that as an evidence of our humanity, and rushing to that to comfort and console.
I've had conversations on different platforms, be it podcast or radio, over the last several months with so many different people in this space. And I don't know that anyone has ever summarized this situation better than what you just did right there. And it hits so deeply, because you see people trying to score political points or, draw neighbors, communities into a place of pure conflict around just having these conversations. At the end of the day, all of that is so superficial as compared with what you just touched on, which is truly spiritual and truly mysterious, and that's the human experience.
And that's how we can be helpful in these times. Because, well, let me just say, I lived for a year in Jerusalem. I'm a second career priest and came to this after 30 years of practicing law in a large corporate firm in Atlanta. And so I was an unusual kind of intern or scholar, and lived in Jerusalem for a year at St. George's College, and had wonderful Israeli Jewish friends, Palestinian Christian friends, Palestinian Muslim friends, Druze friends, and I ache for all of them. And I will say that after spending a year living there on the ground in the old city every day, I knew so much less than I thought I did when I got there and had my first sip of pomegranate juice pressed on an antique press in the old city. I knew so much less after a full year than I thought I knew when I got there about who should get what and what was right. But I knew that these were human beings and my friends, and I ache for them. And I think the humanizing part is the most important thing, because I don't think there is any solution other than through conversation and negotiation, um, to understand what could possibly work out, because any solution involves a loss for the other side, as we're seeing play out daily in national TV.
It's so true. And the simple way to put it is to go, well, it's a give and take, but it's so much more complex than that. And that's such,
It's a zero-sum game,
yes.
and we're seeing that play out, and it's so much death and so much destruction. Um, and you feel that pain if you listen to the mothers. I listened to an Israeli Jewish mother on the news last night, and she aching for her son, who's still held hostage. And that's what's real. That's what's human. Um, and I think that's where we need to be, is to come, all of us come to this place of an understanding that we're all human beings, and this is real loss we're talking about.
Yes. And
It's
that
not a video game.
it is as real as it gets. And that actually is the it's a good tie-in to the second sort of
Mm,
suggestion that's put forth, which is bring the conversation home and starting on common ground. With this conversation so often starts on as opposite of a position, for lack of a better term, as
mm,
one can find, and it becomes a whataboutism, or don't you know your history, and all of these things can be included, but at the end of the day there is a lot of common ground here, and that brings that conversation home.
Let me just say what we're reading on Sunday. Actually, I may not be right about that. It may have been last Sunday, but right now we're straight on in the Revised Common Lectionary in the Advent readings, and we read, "Comfort, comfort ye, my people," right? From Isaiah, which then finds its way into our Christian Gospels. But that common to three faiths, right? Isaiah is common to Islam, it's common to Judaism, and it's common to Christianity. Comfort, comfort ye, my people, right? Why was the prophet Isaiah calling out for comfort? He was calling out through devastation, because there was no comfort. And if there were ever a time for that connection and for us to understand one another, it's evidenced in our readings even now.
And that brings us to the last sort of suggestion here. Again, this is just such an
Mm,
important conversation, which is turn the conversation into action. Now, obviously, that means that the average
mm.
person is likely not going to be selected as the neutral arbiter in resolving the conflict, but there's a lot of action that can be taken. And sometimes
Yes.
that is just as simple as diffusing uh, some of the rhetoric that's out there. It's also sometimes as simple as listening and being empathetic and absorbing some of the pain, absorbing some of the confusion. And it is
Mm,
confusing because you look at what's happening and you go, boy, this does not seem to be a natural place for humans to exist in. At the same time, it's happening, as you said, it's not a video game. So, your suggestion on turning that conversation,
mhm.
difficult as it may be, into practical action.
First, listen. First, speak less than you listen. And don't stake out all of your positions. Hear deeply and encourage the other person to talk about their feelings, not so much their conclusions, academic, well-informed or otherwise, often otherwise, right? But don't encourage the
Right.
other person to stake out those positions. But how do you feel? That must be hard. I can see this has shaken you. That must be really difficult. What would help now? Do you want to talk some more about that? That kind of question, but just being empathetic about that. There's a whole lot of loss, and often that triggers people's own feelings of vulnerability, desperation, aggression in defense, that kind of thing. I think we have to remember where we stand in this, and we are listeners in this. Second, we can help. We can help with dollars. We can help to provide aid to the Palestinians in Gaza through. We can provide aid to the Israelis but for humanitarian aid. So much of the US aid from the government is going to weapons to continue this conflict and not to any kind of mitigation of the human loss or to any kind of reconciliation, which is where we need to be. We need to be human to human in conversation, negotiation, and reconciliation, finding out how people with vastly different views, and they will have vastly different views. Our experiences are all different. How can people with vastly different views come to a place that is acceptable for all? Because everyone with different experience will think a different thing, but the common thing is that they care passionately about it. That same thing that we feel. We care passionately about it, or we wouldn't be so upset. We wouldn't be so hurt by it. But give to the Jewish causes through the Jewish humanitarian aid, and there are many of them, through Christian aid, through Save the Children, UNICEF, Tear Fund, anything like that. Give to support human beings in crisis.
Della Wells, what an incredible conversation and such an important conversation to have, and to be able to localize it back here to our community, because we feel sometimes so out of the orbit of impact when in fact it's true that we're not on the ground. We're not, again, necessarily going to, and maybe someone listening to this right now will be that person that ultimately wins a Nobel Peace Prize and is able to negotiate this. But
From your
that's
lips to God's ears, as our Jewish friends would say.
let's hope. Let's hope that somebody out there does serve that role, or somehow, some way we get through this in a way that is understandable. And in the
Mhm.
meantime, your ignition of this community conversation, it's so incredibly important. And I'm personally and journalistically very thankful for the work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And we do intend at Emmanuel to continue this kind of conversation. We have hosted Sarah Snyder with Rose Castle, who has been active in reconciliation in the most trenchant conflicts in the world, whether it's Ireland and Northern Ireland, Israel and Palestine, tribal areas in the Sahel and Africa. We continue that engagement, and we carry on conversations with Jerusalem peace builders and other reconciliation entities. We mean to be a center for community discussion.